So put on your I like to see new things hat. I asked the pastoral team if they would join me in a conversation instead of me just giving the sermon today. And so if you missed last week, I announced that I am going to be having a scheduled surgical procedure over the summer, and I've asked a pastoral team. We happen to have 4 people highly trained and ready to serve our congregation within our congregation. And so they're going to join me today. We'll get to know them a little bit better. So I'll ask Evan and Aaron and Peter and Rick to gather around the Lord's table. And I'm going to read the text. First we'll pray, of course. I'm going to read the text, and then we're going to begin a conversation together. I get to be the center? Fantastic. All right. So the setup for this text before we pray is Paul is in Athens, and in Athens they had a tradition of wanting to hear new things, of wanting to be in the public square where you could bring ideas and things that you're thinking about or things that you're reading, and then they would discuss it amongst one another. And so we're kind of recreating that this morning. So would you join me in the prayer for illumination, as in your bulletin? Let's pray. Holy God,
remove the stones that block the portals of our minds. Shine your light so that they take over the darkness within. Fill our thoughts with your perfect vision for creation, so we may go and tell and be and do. Amen.
All right, Acts chapter 17, we're going to start in verse 16. It's on page 964. Thought I would be like you and read the Bibles in the pews, but man, it's hard, huh? Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he argued in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who chanced to be there. Some also of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers met him. And some said, "What would this babbler say?" Others said, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, because he preached Jesus and the resurrection." And they took hold of him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is which you present? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what those things mean." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. So Paul, standing in the middle of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all men life and breath and everything. God made from one every nation of men to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their habitation, that they should seek God, in hope that they might feel after him and find him." The word feel there is grope. So that they might seek God in hope that they might grope after him and find him. Yet God is not far from each of us, for in him we live and move and have our beings, as even some of your poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's first offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, a representation by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now God commands all men everywhere to repent, because God has fixed a day on which God will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given us assurance to all men by raising him from the dead. Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, "We will hear you about this." So Paul went out from among them, but some men joined him and believed, among them Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. We believe this to be the word of the Lord. So, what's your first thought after hearing that text? Can you guys hear us okay?
There you
We
go.
have to have a microphone. What's your first thought from the text?
Well, my first thought, because I read a little bit around the text, which I like to do when you get a story like this that's kind of out of context, was that here's this brief sort of moment of dialogue going on about faith in this new place with Paul. Because if you read the previous chapter and then the chapter that follows, he's basically being driven out of every place that he goes. So he's trying to preach the gospel in other places, and actually among even more familiar people. So when he's talking to the Jews, they get really mad at him. And then he's in this place with a totally different group of people, a totally different culture. And I think in a lot of ways, they're the people who are really generous to him in inviting him to talk more about his viewpoints, and you can see that he was received in a much more generous way. So that was surprising to me and interesting, maybe food for thought, kind of when he's among his own people. He seems to have not a very good reception, and maybe it's part of the way he's delivering himself, I don't know. I mean, he's preaching, and he's very, very fervently trying to bring the gospel, to people who maybe don't want to hear it. But then he's in this new place among a new people, and he's received in a really generous way.
First thoughts?
Well, I guess when I first read the text, the Greek philosophers, the schools, the Epicurean school and the Stoic school is what stuck out to me because they're pretty much opposite philosophies, and so it's different ways of thinking about the world, and they would get together and discuss, how you're supposed to live your life, and that's kind of like a very gross generalization of what they would do. But Epicureans were really all about seeking pleasure in life and trying to make yourself happy, because basically they thought you don't have any control over anything else, so that's the greatest possible good. And Stoics rejected that idea and rejected all emotion and said, the best way you can live your life is to follow a good. It doesn't necessarily matter what it is, so they rejected religion, for instance, and things like that. So that's the sort of context that Paul was coming into. So I think they were probably interested in what Paul had to say, because he's referring to this other God and he's claiming knowledge of it that they don't have. So they would just be interested to hear sort of why he thinks he knows what he's talking about, I think. And it's interesting to me that they were like, come tell us about this new thing. Because as Aaron was saying, when Paul was going around, he's hitting these pockets of Judaism that are firmly established, and he's bringing something new to them, something that they're supposedly supposed to be looking for, which is the Messiah, and he's telling them the Messiah has come, and here's the new word, and they aren't actually that interested in it.
I find it interesting that Paul, who, at least in the letters we have, isn't afraid to tell people they're very wrong and they're doing wrong things, here doesn't do that, but instead says, as you've been going about your life and in your entire people's history, my God has been there with you in ways you haven't seen yet or haven't recognized. And so it's interesting, in the people who are generous to him, his rhetoric is very generous back. He doesn't try to supplant so much as kind of introduce a different perspective, even if his long-term strategy is completely supplanting. At least at first, he's saying, look at this other, look at where God is in your life, is I think how we would say it here. I kind of see him saying the same thing in one of the few places where he says it.
Yeah, and kind of along those lines, the dynamic of the idols kind of stuck out to me. And kind of how Paul kind of started to kind of speak to that, and like talking to them that they know these things, but there's so much more. Maybe the kind of behind the scenes dynamic of like you've been distracted by these other gods, these other idols, and that's very curious to me in this, and what he's starting to do with them. I think that's something that I see in my life on a regular basis. Just like what things distract me from the true God, what things do become idols for me.
I wonder, like, picking up on maybe what Rick was saying, sort of, and then taking it a different way. Paul is essentially like affirming some things in their life, or that their pursuit of God, their way of pursuing it may be different than how he does when he affirms it. And so I started the service with talking about how God is working in your life. And so Paul was essentially saying to them, you know some things about God, but there's some things you don't know, right? Which is also what Evan was saying, that there's this whole other thing you don't know. So how would you guys answer, to totally put you on a personal, right? What are you, in the last year, what have you learned of God? I'll go first, because that's not fair. It gives them a chance to think, right? I'll go first. And this is one of the things I said to the confirmation class, too. I think with the merge, there have been moments of time where I have realized that God is using all of my gifts at one time. And it's the first time I've ever felt that way, where like it was like square peg, square hole. Like everything worked right. And I've been in times in my life where following the Spirit seemed hard, and then you always question, like, is this the right thing? If it's too hard, is it the right thing to do, right? Shouldn't the right thing be easy? There were so many times in this last year where things were incredibly easy, like where you question if it's right because it's too easy, right? And so I've been really wrestling. So I can't say I've completely learned something yet, but I'm wrestling with the balance between when things are too hard and when things are too easy, and where is God in that? Did I give you enough time?
I can answer because Beth made me answer this last week. I think I've been thinking a lot about the words faith and faithfulness, and as the good seminarians up here will tell you, a lot of times the word faith can be translated as faithfulness in Scripture. So I think in this past season, my faith has consisted more of faithfulness than faith in kind of the belief sense. So kind of feelings or doubts kind of are always a stir, but that kind of in this season, living in the faith means living faithfully rather than living in a state of perfect kind of belief faith all the time, which is a big adjustment for someone who lives in his head.
This year, for me, largely through my time at the hospital, in my chaplaincy role, learning what chaplaincy is and learning what can be authority, and kind of the general idea of our authority as Christians and what that means has been really huge for me. It's kind of like thrown everything out of, kind of everything off the shelf for me, like what I thought I knew of how God has worked in my life and what my responsibility is, what my role is as a Christian, and things like that. Yeah, because I think a lot of people, I walk into a lot of rooms and I think I get this I get this assumption from people that my role is to be like, oh, don't worry, everything's gonna be fine. Can you just pray for me? But and I see that a lot in our world, that that's what Christians do. It's like, okay, don't worry, trust God, it'll be fine, I'll pray for you. But I've gotten this whole new kind of curveball of authority kind of thrown at me, and I've been thinking on that all year and what that means for us as Christians to really claim our authority as God's hands and feet and do and be, not just to trust and pray, but to also be and do. We are challenged and encouraged by God to like see where God's at work and not just like point to it, but go and jump in and like grab onto that and wield it with authority. And that's been really wild for me this year. But it's not just kind of acknowledging what God is doing, but like diving in and getting our hands dirty with that. Not just patting somebody on the shoulder and reminding them to trust, but like getting into their junk with them and like helping them see what they haven't seen and learning from that at the same time. And so, like just my authority as a Christian has been really huge. Yeah, really huge.
I think this sort of dovetails with some of the things that you guys are learning. I feel like one of the big lessons for me this year has been to not put your faith in things, but to put your faith in God. And so for me, I am a real type A person. I have a lot of plans. I make a lot of lists. I get a lot accomplished. And I get really frustrated sometimes when those like lists and plans are disrupted. And so the challenge for me has been to rely on God, that a lot of times the possibilities that God has in store are better than anything I would think of. But I don't really trust God a lot of times with that. I really want to stick to my plans because I feel comfortable, and then I have control, and that feels good. But I realize that living with God is all about being out of control. It's all about kind of what Peter is saying, having this radical faith where the things that you can't even see yet, those are the things that you want in the future. And I'm putting my sights a lot of times on things that I can imagine and I can see, and sometimes they're good, and sometimes they're very good, but they may really pale in comparison to what God has. And so if I can just hang on a little bit longer, or if I can just trust a little bit deeper, I have found that God provides in ways that I couldn't possibly imagine.
Yeah, I suppose my learnings about God this year are somewhat similar to Erin's, having walked many of the same paths with her this year. But I think for me the takeaway is that when you think you know what you're supposed to be doing or how you're supposed to act or where you're supposed to go, that's often when you've got it completely wrong. In my experience, and it's not always an easy lesson to learn when you have to figure that out. But it's also, I guess, as Erin was saying, there's something that you're working toward that you are wanting to achieve or wanting to get or whatever it is, and it could very much pale in comparison to what God has in store for you, which is potentially completely different, a completely different road to walk down. So sometimes that change of direction can be really painful and hard, but it doesn't have to be. But it's a really humbling experience to work really, really hard towards something, and then feel like nothing's working out, and then to just have something fall in your lap. It's just like, what?
Yeah, exactly. So over email this week, when we were preparing to have this discussion, I asked if there was anything that you're reading or thinking about that would be helpful if you would have a conversation with other people of faith. Right? So if you think about it during the course of the week, I'm sure that you read tons of things, you have news going on in your head, you have TV shows going on in your head, and so I asked them if there was anything that they're thinking about that they wanted to have a conversation about. And so they have a packet in front of them, or we're going to pick one and kind of kick it around, but Erin mentioned that there's this conversation happening about privilege on the Princeton University campus. She also said that she's not completely comfortable having a conversation here with primarily white people, but that might be a helpful thing for us to do. So we had that kicking around on email. The 9/11 memorial opened this week, which kicked up some conversation for me and some of my friends.
And not just about the memorial, but like, what is memorial? What do we look for in a memorial? What is the purpose of a memorial? But then it also kicked up all the articles that happened at the 10-year anniversary, like what 9/11 causes us to forget. Do you remember that conversation? Because it was a while ago. But so that was also kicking around in email. And then the other thing was the Bring Back Our Girls campaign and the conversation happening around that, whether that's a positive thing or a negative thing, if it's having positive results or if it's not going to have positive results. So those are the things that we sort of kicked around. And the reason I asked them is that I think the big thing for Paul is that he assumed that his faith informs discussions that he has. Does that make sense? Like, he assumed that his faith would have something to say to the people around them. And so the one I want to kick around, I'm going to give it to Aaron to explain what happened with the conversation about privilege, and then I'm going to ask the folks at the table how their faith informs this discussion. Okay?
So I'm not sure how many of you read about this in the news, but essentially what happened was a Princeton University freshman, who is a white male, published a piece in the conservative newspaper on campus called The Tory, and it was called something like Check Your Privilege, and he was referring to an experience he had on campus, he says, after class when he was talking about his opinions on, I think, welfare and the national debt, and a student came by and at some point in the conversation said to him, check your privilege. And he said that this phrase, check your privilege, has been going around the Princeton University campus and other college campuses. And he was very frustrated by it, and so the op-ed kind of that he wrote was responding to this phrase and saying that it shuts down conversation instead of igniting debate and conversation. And he was also defending himself because as a white male, he says that he's perceived by his looks that he's a person of privilege, and being at Princeton University, I imagine that's part of it. But he told some of his personal history in the piece in the Princeton paper, where he talked about that his ancestors actually went through the Holocaust, and many of them were assassinated during the Holocaust, and then came to this country and worked very hard to start a small business. And he was attaching himself to these stories, and he said he felt these were more motivating. So eventually this piece in this small Princeton paper, and he himself were picked up by the New York Times. He was on Fox News talking about how he had successfully defended himself as a white male to kind of everybody else in the country with this check your privilege phrase. So it continues to be an interesting conversation right now at Princeton and on other college campuses about, I think, primarily what this phrase does. And the privilege piece, I should say, in my experience, it's referring to a conversation about white privilege that was actually initiated by Heidi McIntosh, who's a feminist scholar in the 70s, where she wrote this list of 40 things that she said are white privilege, characteristics of white privilege, and they're things like, I don't ever have to be, or I'm pretty assured that I won't be the only person of my race in the room, or I don't ever have to speak for my race, or when I go to buy something at a gas station, I won't be scrutinized because of my race. And trying to understand the experience of being white alongside the experience of, you know, being a person of color in this country, and trying to understand and get into that experience of white privilege. So anyway, that's part of the background of the conversation. I don't know if anybody is responding to this.
I'm just going to give a broad, because I forgot to say that one of the great things about Presbyterian is that we have a rich history of speaking about the Bible alongside of the current events, right? That's a true thing of being Presbyterian. Is Karl Barth in the middle of the Second World War said that any preacher should have a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other hand. That's how we do justice to who God is. And so it's okay for us as Presbyterians to talk about what's going on in the world. So the question really is, how would your faith inform a conversation about this? Did you have something you want to say first?
Yeah, I just wanted to add just a little bit more context to this story because it's part of national media now. It's really, really a big story. But you know, as I work at Princeton University, I'm an administrator, I work with students. Nobody cares about this story. Like, the students don't care. It's not a story for them. So that's just like a little bit of background.
Yep. So how
does your faith inform a discussion like this? I'm only asking them, sorry, Debbie. I'm only asking them around the table.
Well, I can speak to that. I mean, Evan and I were talking a little bit about this on the way here in the car, and how media and the storms that are created around something like this conversation that happened between a couple people, on Princeton's campus, after class, can often shut down dialogue instead of encouraging it. And so it seems like what's happening now is everyone's taking sides. So, people are saying, oh, well, he's wrong. He should not be defending himself. He's clearly a privileged person, and therefore he has no legs to stand on. He shouldn't be, talking. And then there's another side, that's saying, well, he's gone and defended himself, in the most appropriate way. He should be allowed to say whatever he wants to say. And so we were talking about this a bit on the way here, and how I think it's really tempting as people of the church to just participate in media the way media sets up the conversation. So to take sides and say, well, I'm on this guy's side, or I'm against him. But wouldn't it be, exciting if the church could actually be a place in our society that in many ways has shut down dialogue, to create dialogue, to open that up, and to have a conversation where I think people are personally engaging with one another. And so I actually think this guy's point that, if you just say to someone rather rudely, check your privilege when they're talking to you, it really does shut down the conversation. On the other hand, I'm not sure he's listening to what they're saying about the experience of white privilege and how that really is a very specific experience that a white male has in America and what a white male represents and the privilege that a white male is afforded. That still sees something that's worth talking about. So I think that it's exciting to me to imagine that in the church we can have conversations with one another that actually are pluralistic. So a range of opinions would be represented, and we talk to one another, and we care about these things because we are people of faith, because we want our society to be whole, rather than simply saying, well, did you hear about the controversy? Yeah, I am totally defending him, or I'm totally against him.
How does your faith inform?
I think from my context at Princeton Seminary until, I guess, last week, I think I would estimate or hypothesize that nowhere does this type of phrase come up more in the country than at Princeton Seminary itself. I would say it's more of a crucible than Princeton University. And from my particular event, I think it's overall a good more than a bad. So I guess, in as much as my faith is about bringing people from the margins to the center, the phrase "check your privilege," or its various iterations as it's found, of kind of shutting down dominant voices, in as much as it hurts to be the one that's done to, it does create this space for voices who are elbowed out otherwise. So particularly when you have our seminary is constructed, but you go to class and you have these small groups that meet for 2 of your 3 hours of class. In that small group, you work through material by discussing it. So when various kind of shutdown phrases like "check your privilege" happens, they're often born out of a place of, I have already felt violence done to my opinion, so I'm going to do violence to your opinion so that I can create space for me and other people like me to finally say our opinion. So I don't think it's the best phrase, but I do think it sparks something that otherwise we wouldn't talk about. And I think sometimes, I'm not sure if I want to say this out loud, but I think sometimes there is an intermediate evil of violence to achieve a greater intermediate good of safety.
Say that a different way.
So,
Pretend you're not a senator.
I think sometimes hurting someone else creates the possibility for more safety.
Sometimes you gotta swing a punch to get your word in?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, not me.
Someone.
I get punched.
Right.
You can see
He's
that.
giving way. Okay. All right.
And I guess it was just, sorry. I'm just personally like this type of critique, when I kind of first heard it used against myself in college, was shattering, but it was also eye-opening, and it was a part of my sort of, I think, personal evolution.
Yeah, I think in recent years I've learned a lot, or at least kind of thought a lot about the difference between the content and the form, kind of the what and the how, and this kind of resonates for me faith-wise, because something like, I'm kind of reeling a little bit from Rick's description, because I can see that a little bit the way he's described it, but like for me, like that kind of phrase in that kind of context, like does shut down and is judgmental and is accusatory, or it certainly can be taken that way. And really, I don't know, I think on the majority side of how I see it, I think that limits dialogue. I think if there's something there, I think we all need to look really difficultly at ourselves in different circumstances. But it's really hard to do that when someone's created this like defensive posture in you by how they've gone about it. Because I think that kind of provokes a debate rather than a conversation, or these judgments rather than a dialogue. And I think faith-wise for me, I think about this in like hospital visits where like, I walk in and in like 2 minutes I've had this conversation where I've realized this person is like really like they're doing really unhealthy things, but they've been doing them for 40 years. And so if I just kind of jump in and like point my finger at it and be like, why have you been doing, like, like if I'm jumping in and being accusatory and being kind of rash about it, they're not going to hear that. They're going to get judgmental and defensive and all this stuff. Whereas, like, if I try and initiate a conversation about like needs and I don't know, just go about it a different way. Like, there's still that what, but in going about it in a different how, I think it just creates. It just creates a different way of going about it.
I'm really intrigued. The conversation, I don't know if you, and I'm watching the time. It's 20 till 6, according to that clock. And I'm doing the math, and I'm still watching the time. So I'm intrigued that the conversation that we had was more about the method of how the phrase came out and not actually about privilege. And so when I asked you, how does your faith inform this discussion, you answered it, but you just didn't answer it the way that I thought. And so if we had more time, I would press and say, but about the conversation, the topic, what does your faith say? But you did answer it on how... I know, I'm afraid to go there, because I have a response too. Like, I'm looking at the time, it's 20 to 6. But I do hear us saying, like, there's an element of self-control that is required, and our faith speaks to that, right? So if someone has hurts us in some way because they need to in order to be heard, then we can look for our own level of self-control to find. I hear from you saying that the conversation needs to have elements of kindness or gentleness in it, and that would go both ways, right? If you see something wrong, then our faith informs us in such a way to say things in a gentle way, or to not say it until you know how to say it in a way that's constructive, that will move the conversation. Does that make sense? And I got lost somewhere by you guys, but it was interesting that we had to go there, and it also makes sense, by the way, that we would have to go there first because of the 5 people at the table, 3 of them are white men. So it makes sense that we would have to do that first. So for the people of color in the room, I'm realizing, right, they know this more than I do as even a white woman, that we always have to make people feel like they can enter the conversation before they can enter the conversation. And now, if we had more time, I would say, let's talk about privilege and what the scriptures have to say about that. And the first thing I would say, and I'll give Evan the last word, the first thing I would say about it is that the Christian tradition is by nature a minority religion. It is a religion for people on the margins. It has always been a religion for people on the margins. And the most difficult thing I find, being your pastor in the 21st century in America, the superpower of the world, is to constantly read the scriptures from a side that is not ever going to be mine. But everywhere in the scriptures, God has been for the people of color, what we would call in this conversation, or the marginalized, the people that do not have power, that do not have privilege, that do not have a voice. Those were the people of the Exodus. And that's where our story begins.
Last word.
Last word. So, I think, just to kind of follow that up, I firmly agree with what you just said. And, as Christians, we believe in a God that manifested in human form. And, why do we believe in that? Why did that happen? Why did that take place? And I think that can be very helpful, that question, in thinking about privilege, because God is God, and then God chose to be human in order to participate in humanity, and I guess you could say in order to hear us. And it's really, really hard to do that as human beings, to hear other people, and it can be very challenging. You have to sometimes check yourself, check your privilege. And so I guess if I think about how does our faith inform a discussion of privilege, it starts with that. I participated in a lot of interfaith dialogue through my role at university, and what I realized is if I just shut up and listen, I can learn a lot.
Thanks.
I would agree.
Would you stand with me as we affirm our faith together?